Alright, this is our 1912 Stanley Steamer Mountain Wagon. These cars kind of played an integral part in the early transportation up here in Washington State, up in the mountains in particular. The Solduck Hot Springs Lodge, when it was built in 1912, bought 4 of these Stanley Mountain Wagons to bring people from Port Angeles up to the lodge. And with those 4 cars, they could bring 44 people up at one time. The car basically is a steam engine with a boiler. Instead of the engine up front, underneath the hood is actually a boiler and a burner. Think of this like your hot water tank. You've got your burner down below. It's got a pilot light that's always on. It runs on Coleman fuel. When the sensor senses it needs more steam pressure in the boiler, it opens a valve that lets the main fuel, which is kerosene, flow down into these mix tubes, and it swirls around down there. Comes through a boiler plate with 3,000 little pinholes on it, and that vaporized kerosene gets on top and is ignited by the pilot light, and you end up with 1.5 million BTUs of flame. Inside the boiler, which is hot, there's 1,000 fire tubes. They're copper tubes about the size of your little finger. They're flared at the top and the bottom, and the flame comes up through those tubes and distributes the heat inside the boiler. They also act as safety valves. If you get it too hot, it's copper, they anneal and you lose your flare and you lose your pressure. If you get it overpressurized, copper's a little soft and it'll deform and you lose your seal and you lose your pressure. So they've never ever blown up a Stanley boiler. But this is called a 30 horsepower steam engine that's in this car. The engine itself is actually bolted to the rear axle. Steam cars don't need transmissions because you're getting the full power at 1 RPM, just like a locomotive engine. So we have it set up here pretty much restored and operational. The headlights run on acetylene gas. There's an acetylene gas tank underneath the floorboard there. That runs the headlights, and it also runs the starter. You simply, to start it, you unplug your rubber hose off the acetylene bottle, stick your torch in it, and you start the car with a torch. That's why most women were driving Stanley Steamers back in 1912. And what until 14, when Cadillac came out with a self-starter that you could start your car, most women couldn't physically crank an engine. So they typically drove Stanley Steamers and Baker Electrics. So these were pretty popular cars back then. In fact, Stanley was the largest selling automobile from 99 all the way up until about 1906, 1907. It was the top manufacturer in the United States. So basically what happens is you have all your pressure being created up here. There's a line that goes back to the engine, and it is controlled by the throttle up on the quadrant here. This simply delivers the volume of pressure. So even at 1 RPM, you're getting the full 275 horsepower at the rear wheels. So you can pull a heavy load up a steep hill even at 4 or 5 miles an hour, and it just keeps chugging up the mountain, which is what these were designed to do. We pressurize the pilot tank fuel up to about 20 pounds, and that's what this gauge is for. Then we pressurize the fuel up to 120 pounds for the kerosene. Kerosene, we also, to get it to go from a liquid directly to a vapor, we pressurize it and we heat it up. We actually run the fuel line through the flame and get it up to 600 degrees. So it's hot and it's pressurized, so when it hits the branch forks and goes into those mix tubes, it goes instantly from a liquid directly to a vapor without going through the atomization part of it. The boiler pressure is registered here. The pilot light temperature is registered here. You've got a speedometer and a clock. Up on the top here, this is your quadrant that regulates your amount of steam into the engine. It's all a rack and pinion drive. It's got mechanical pumps. There's no electrical system on the car, so we have mechanical pumps that run the operation of the car. We've got one arm that's connected all the way back to the back of the engine, and this arm just goes back and forth, and it's hooked up to this 4-point attach fitting. And the left side is the rear water pump, and then the forward water pump. Then you've got the fuel pump and the oil pump. So all 4 of those units are operated by this one pump simply going back and forth. The drawback is that the car doesn't, or the engine doesn't move unless the car moves, because it's direct drive. So to take care of that, to bring our pressures and water up to speed, we have these hand pumps that are connected to this lever here. So we have to pump everything up to pressure. Once we get going down the road, then the manual pumps are taken over by the mechanical pumps. So that's how that system works on the Stanley. A lot of tubing. There's 158 linear feet of copper tubing in the car. This, of course, is a 12-passenger car. It's 4 seats, 3 across. Weighs about 6,000 pounds fully loaded. So it's a different experience to drive the car because of being so high up. It allows people to see things that they ordinarily wouldn't see as they drive down the road. Of course, we only go about 15 or 20 miles on the cruise around Orcas Island here, so you feel like you're part of the forest or the homestead that we're showing you, or the one-room schoolhouse. We slow down enough and we're setting up in the air high enough that you see things that you just ordinarily wouldn't see. So the car is quite a comfortable car for 1912. It's got 4 elliptical sets of springs on each axle. And it basically really is a really sweet driving car. Now, it does have its quirks. You do have a flame going all the time. Like Jay Leno says, they're made out of wood, they're always on fire, and they'll go 70 miles an hour. So it's the trifecta of a combination of things that ordinarily you wouldn't think about when you're driving your new car today. But the cars themselves are pretty reliable. They had to be back in the old days to go up in the mountains. Again, the cars were called Mountain Wagons at the time because they were the only cars that had enough power to get you up the mountain, but they had the brakes to get you down the mountain without killing you. The reason being is steam engines will run backwards, so at the top of the mountain you'd simply slide the car into reverse, which is just redirecting the steam to the other side of the piston, and that allows you to control your descent rate with the throttle. You've got the full engine horsepower to convert to act as a brake. You never have to put your foot on the actual manual brake pedal coming down the mountain as you're using the steam brakes. So you can only do that with a steam car. So that's what made these so unique and so well used up in the mountains. And it can climb a 8% grade at 5 miles an hour, just like nobody's business. The reason being that it had to do that, the roads were so poor up in those hills and mountains that there were rocks and gullies and potholes that you couldn't really go any faster. When this car was new, only about 3% of the roads in the United States were even paved. So it was something that really gave you a good ride on rough roads. Also, that's why we have 38-inch tires on the car. If you look back on the far side over here and look at these wheels, these are 38-inch tires on wooden wheels. This time that this car was built, they didn't have bridges going across a lot of the streams. You just went through in your wagon and your horse. The horse needed a drink of water anyway, so these cars had to be able to ford and go across streams and uneven terrain, wet or dry. So it was a pretty unique automobile for a pretty unique purpose. They only made 246 of these cars from 1909 until 1916. And of those 246, there's about 12 of them in museums and about 12 of them left in private hands. This is the only Stanley Steamer mountain wagon, in fact, that we're aware of, left in the United States that's still in commercial service. We usually come out here on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays in front of the Orcas Island Museum, and we give 1-hour tours around the island past the old historic homesteads and a lot of the old orchards, and we kind of show you the out-of-the-way places that are kind of unique to this island. And it lasts about an hour, and when you come back you'll have a new appreciation for what a steam car can do and the places it can go, and a better appreciation of Orcas Island in general. Well, this only gets about 10 miles to the gallon of kerosene, and it gets about, which is not bad for a 12-passenger car. However, it gets about 1 mile to the gallon of water, which in the old days was not a bad deal because you had a horse trough every half a mile or 2 miles, and towns were closer together. See, when this car was built, they didn't have gas stations yet. They hadn't been invented. So you could always go to your general store And when you stop off at the general store, because everybody was still using kerosene lamps, you could buy your kerosene in a 5-gallon pail, and before you went into the store, you'd simply unfurl your hose over here on the side of the running board, turn on the siphon valve, which allowed the steam to siphon the water in out of the horse trough. So you'd put that in the horse trough, and by the time you went in to get your 5-gallon bucket of kerosene, you'd siphoned in enough water to fill up your water tanks, pour your kerosene in, good to go. So it was a little different experience in the early days of how you got from point A to B, but we can go about 80 miles between fill-ups on water with the car. We can go about 200 miles on the kerosene capacity we have. But for the old days, 75, 80 miles was a long distance between point A and point B.
Sure.
So it's for its time, this was the fastest, most advanced car on wheels. Nothing could outrun a Stanley Steamer.
So today, I mean, its top speed is 70 miles an hour. Could you take it on the freeway?
We could, and we can do that right now if we want to. It's more fun to drive it at 15 miles an hour around Orcas Island. There is one spot where we go up to about 40 and let everybody just imagine what 70 would be like. So it's a pretty fast car for a big 12-passenger car. Now the little Roadster, the 2-seat Roadster that Stanley made, it had the capacity to go well over 100 miles an hour. In fact, in 1906, the Stanley Company set the speed record of 127 miles an hour in 1906.
Okay.
So that was pretty fast. That was faster than airplanes would fly at the time. Ignition systems were so primitive back then that they weren't as reliable as they are today. So cars back then weren't all that reliable, but once you get the steam car up and running, you get the pilot light going, you get the boiler going, and you get it nice and toasty, then they just run forever. As long as it's got fuel, the flame will just keep burning. So that's the story between the Stanley Steamer Mountain Wagon and Washington State. Washington State was about the 3rd highest registration of Stanley Mountain Wagons. Colorado was #1. In fact, the car was actually developed for the Stanley Hotel up in Estes Park, Colorado. The Stanley brothers were identical twins, and they built the Stanley Hotel, and they needed a vehicle to bring people up from the railhead up to the lodge. And so they took their biggest steam engine and developed this, and the first 6 actually went at the hotel in 1906. It worked out so well, they decided, well, we're just going to put them into production, and they were first offered in the 1909 catalog. So 246 cars later in 1916 was the end of the production line for them. So they were rare to start with, and it's even more rare to find parts and pieces for them to this day. So it's a difficult car to maintain, and that's why we give rides out here and tours, is to help pay for the maintenance of the automobile and keep it running. But we try and run all the way through October. But it's a nice way to enjoy Orcas Island.
When you get to too much pressure, they have all the systems have a bypass. So it stops pumping and allows it to go back into the system in another way, so that you're not feeding more and more and more. That's the whole thing with steam boilers as well. You have a safety valve like you have on your water heater at home. And then these cars have speedometers and clocks also.
Yeah, I got 363 degrees.
Okay, well for
That main fuel line.
Not like my car right.
you got it. You got it. I cranked that wheel when I stopped.
You got it. We'll be back in an hour for another tour.
Bye, Brakemanville.
Hey, Mickey.
Keep it